thus endeth the loaf. Okay, welcome everyone. We'll get started. Autumn, I'm so sorry. I didn't even it just.
My whole life, it's just the squishing. I'm A-okay, not offended at all.
I didn't even know I did it. It just happened. So happy to see all of your faces here. I feel like if you have turned up for this class, you have outed yourself as a nerd of the highest order. So welcome to Nerd Town. Say it loud, say it proud. You're a geek. So welcome. The invitation with me, as always, is an invitation. You can feel free to decline. You can feel free to turn your camera off. You can feel free to do whatever version of this is comfortable for you. So you could scoot forward on the edge of your seat and plant your feet and do a little yawn and a stretch, or you can get up out of your chair and move around a little bit, send a little oxygen, send a little blood, send a little breath to whatever is sore, whatever is tight. Oh, whatever is held or angry. There's plenty of good reasons to be angry these days. And since you're in the privacy of your own little box with your microphone off, if you want to sigh out on a little sound, if that's comfortable for you, I invite that as well. And once you've had a little yawn and a little stretch, or patiently endured while the rest of us did that, I would invite you to come back to your camera if you can, if that's available for you, if that's comfortable. And I think we'll start with just a little check-in and a little introducing. Yeah. So I'm gonna ask you to introduce yourself with 4, maybe 5 pieces of information. Math is hard. I do Shakespeare. I can only count to 10 anyway. So I would ask you to share, I'm gonna throw these in the chat. Your name, pronouns, your relationship to Genius Boy, who we're gonna be spending our time with. Then if you were a character in Shakespeare today, or in general, who would you be? And then what you want to learn in this class. Why are you here for this deeply nerdy, this is not a drama lit class, Shakespeare class? My name is Kate. For those of you who don't know me, I think I've met everybody here. I think Becky, you're the only person I'm meeting for the very first time. Maybe Casey, I can't remember if we've seen each other yet this week. I've just emailed. I'm Kate, my pronouns are she and her. I'm also partial to hag because I feel a little bit like the crone who lives on the outside of the village who might have some medicine for what ails you. If I was a character in Shakespeare, there is no question I would be Beatrice all day long. I will eat his heart in the marketplace just for fun, and I'm a vegetarian, so I'll spit it right back out again. My relationship to Shakespeare, this is long and complicated. The too long didn't read version is that on my first date with my now husband, I told him that whatever happened, it was going to be a 3-way because there was this other guy that I spend so much of my time with. And he came back for a second date after that. So I knew he was a keeper. What I want to learn is what you want to learn and how to facilitate that for you. This is the first time I'm teaching this. This is stuff that is in my spinal fluid. So I want to make sure I learn how to share it with you in a way that invites you all in to this work. Yeah. And I am going to pass it to Liam.
Thank you, Kate. Sorry, that's my 5-year-old in the background. I am Liam Toner. My pronouns are he, him, his. If I was a character in Shakespeare, I feel like I would think of myself as Hamlet, but I'm more of a Dogberry. And then my relationship to Shakespeare is I read Kieran. He's playing on his tablet. The first Shakespeare play I ever read was actually Troilus and Cressida when I was in, I think, oh man, I was a freshman in high school, I think. Well, I read Shakespeare before that, but the first Shakespeare play I ever studied. And I fell in love with it. And what do I want to learn from this class? I've acted in Shakespeare plays. I've never directed a Shakespeare play. So I want to learn how to take it from the page to the stage, people. And I will popcorn to Noah.
Thank you, Mr. Liam. Hi, everybody. My name is Noah Luce. I use he, him pronouns. I also like helper, as Kate has inspired me to add a third H in there. What else? My relationship to Shakespeare, I have been in love with the language my whole life, it feels like. In third grade, my teacher didn't know what to do with me, and so she handed me Macbeth, of all plays. That was my first Shakespeare, and I fell in love. If I was a character in a Shakespeare play, y'all, I'm gonna say it, but y'all don't have to do or anything. But I am Helena through and through from Midsummer. That is just who I am. And I love her more than anything because I feel her on every level. So
Your eyes are lodestars, Noah.
Oh, shucks. I'm gonna popcorn it. Oh, well, I am now captured by this beautiful puppy dog of Evelyn's. So Evelyn, I'm gonna have to popcorn it to you.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm gonna be a little boring because I'm Evelyn Tucker, pronouns she, her. This is Aria, as in
Awesome.
Arya Stark. My relationship to Shakespeare. I am a Shakespeare nerd, even though I probably have many more texts to read. Anytime that I have access to, I don't know, the Royal Shakespeare Company's virtual library, or I just start streaming whatever Shakespeare production they have on. Let's see. I don't know. I've always been drawn to Shakespeare. I sometimes feel like it's such a challenge to understand or get underneath the text, but at the same time, once it feels like you get it, it can almost flow as though it's I don't know. It can almost flow as though I can grasp it, or I think that I grasped some of it. But yet there's so much more to learn, and that's why I'm here, because I still consider myself a novice, even though Shakespeare has been in my life since high school, as for many other people. I think that answers my relationship and what I want to learn. But yes, Aria will be attending class with us for the remainder of the semester.
Evelyn, if you were a character in Shakespeare, which one might you be?
Oh, that's why I meant boring, because I can't think. I've loved let's see. Who would I be? Well, now I'm blanking because I feel like I'm gonna mispronounce a few names.
That is okay.
Viola. I would definitely like to be Viola.
Okay,
I did do a scene of hers. So
nice. And then would you invite somebody to go next, please, Evelyn?
I am so bad at this. Autumn.
All good.
Never bad, only good. My name is Autumn and I use she, her. And I'm so excited to be here. And let's see, what else? When I was in middle school, I was like a middle school theater nerd, and I was cast as Titania, and then my parents were like, we're never gonna drive you to rehearsals, are you joking? So then I was not in the show, but just equally as obsessed, and if anything, more obsessed, because it was like, I wish, if only. And then when I was in high school, we moved overseas, and I was able to see a couple shows at the Globe, and it was just, I'm crying. As like a little high schooler, it was so precious. When I went to university, I was in the I auditioned for and was chosen for the Nashville Shakespeare Festival Apprentice Company. So I performed and taught and learned with them, and thus began my like more intense Shakespeare excitement. And I'm here to learn everything Kate ever says. I am a Shakespeare nerd. I'm also a Kate nerd, and I'm sorry, Kate, but I love you so much. And I think I speak for many of us, but they don't have to own it as much as I am. And I am fully stepping into my witch, hag, dog, old lady identity, because that's what I've been cast as so frequently. So I think I'm probably a Macker's witch, or I don't know, that character that just kind of bops around and doesn't really know what's happening most of the time, Stefano, or you know what I'm about. And that's me. And did I say I'm excited? Because I'm really excited. And I'm going to pass it to Emily.
Hi, thanks, Autumn. I love having you in the class. So energetic. Emily, she, her, frog. Sometimes you'll see Kermit. He's currently at the theater, so we don't get him today. Relationship to Shakespeare. I am the non-nerd, so I don't know all of the things, and that's why I'm here. I'm excited to learn whatever I can, observe, and soak in as a sponge. Which means I'm probably just one of the fairies that doesn't have a name. I was Peas Blossom once, but I'm not feeling the Peas Blossom today. And yeah, so I'm here to just observe in as much as I can, and maybe I'll even have something to say someday. Who knows? I'm excited to be here, and I will pop it over to Becky.
Sorry, I got distracted. Gizmo started sniffing me weirdly. Weirdo. Stop it. No, you don't get to come up. Sorry. I'm going to keep talking to him. Okay, so hi, Becky Guthrie. Hold on, I have to go back to the list. She, her. Shakespeare. I've done a lot, I feel like. I've never performed it. I've seen a lot of the local stuff. I have sent a kid to the National Shakespeare competition. She landed in the top 10, so she did get to do that, which is really cool. If I were a character, I think, and I totally cheated and had to look it up. I was like, who would I be? I don't know. I was thinking Bianca in Taming of the Shrew. And I just want to learn all the things because I love learning, and I wish I could convince my high school kids to not hate Shakespeare, but I don't know that that's ever going to happen, unfortunately, but we're going to keep trying. So, and if I didn't give relationship, I started reading Shakespeare in high school. I had to take Shakespeare in college to graduate with my English degree. So he's definitely been around a lot in my life. Oh, okay. And I will pass it to Lauren.
Hi. I'm sorry I'm late. I'm probably always going to be a few minutes late. I work until 3:25. It takes me half an hour to get home. They held buses. So I'm so glad to be here. My name is Lauren. My pronouns are she, her, hers. There's a whole pronoun explosion at my school right now that is insane. My relationship with Shakespeare is that they made me read Caesar and Romeo and Juliet starting in about the 9th grade, and that might literally have been the first play that wasn't like a summer camp show that I ever encountered in an academic setting. And I had a fabulous AP English teacher who taught us Midsummer and the Scottish play and Henry the IV part 2 maybe, and Hamlet, and sort of got into alternate assignments. So she had us on our feet in English in high school doing scenes rather than reading text. And so I've read those 6 and then a handful in college. I do not know everything. I read a lot of contemporary drama. I struggle real hard with old language, but I enjoy it. I will brag for a moment. I've seen Ian McKellen naked as King Lear in London. It was incredible. And I have seen Ewan McGregor and Chiwetel Ejiofor as Othello and Iago, also in London on the same trip. And those were transformative, like life-changing experiences. Unbelievable. If I were a Shakespeare character, I think that I would most like to play Iago.
Yeah.
I live in a very race aware culture, and I think that there is a lot of racial tension in Othello that gets teased out, and Iago's badness is really intriguing to me. I don't want to be a bad guy, but I sure would like to play that bad guy. I don't identify as a performer first. I identify as a director and all that. But the other Shakespeare character, and this is fan fiction, there's a short play called The Nurse's Rebellion by a woman named Sandra Finishel Asher. I have no idea if I pronounced that right, in which Juliet's nurse makes an argument to Shakespeare that he shouldn't kill Juliet. And I would like to be that nurse. What I would like to learn in this class is whatever is available. I will consume all the media and listen to all the things and make all the not coherent sentences and sounds come out of my face. And I'm late, so I don't know who's already gone.
Can you raise your hand for Lauren if you haven't gone yet?
I will pass to Brad Yance.
You're very close.
Thanks.
It's Brad Yance. Rhymes with sconce. It's the only thing I've ever figured out to tell people. And my pronouns are he, him. My relationship to Shakespeare is, I think the first experience I had was in 5th grade. We were assigned to read a poem of our choice. And for whatever reason, I convinced my teacher that I should read To Be or Not to Be. And that has sent me on probably a lifelong existential crisis that I can trace back to that exact moment. And for that reason, I would probably use Hamlet as my who I would be. What do I want to learn? That's really interesting. I am terrified of Shakespeare. I've spent the last 25 years doing theater, but mostly musicals. And so I want to be as nerdy about Shakespeare as I am about musicals and Star Wars. Shout out to Kate, who made the Scum and Villainy reference, which is a Star Wars reference. So that's what I want to learn. I want to dig in and be a sponge. And because this is just my way, I will pass it on to my fellow Brad Lemons.
It's the group of Brads. That's what we got. Hi, I'm Brad Lemons. He, him. I started as Shakespeare as an actor. I started at the National Shakespeare Conservatory, and from there went to the UK and studied with Patsy Rodenberg over there. And so she got me to kind of love it a lot. I wanted to be the next great Simon Russell Beale and Ian McKellen and Alex Jennings, and I wasn't that good, so I didn't. For the last 20 years, I've been a fight director, so my Shakespeare has been a kind of a foundational basis of my income, and I've done way too many of those. And if I was a character, I really want to be Falstaff, but I think it's probably closer to Bottom or Malvolio, probably. And what I want to do here is I just kind of think about Shakespeare outside of the purview of putting it up on a stage, you know, like just kind of focusing on how do I get this done in this context, but to think about it in a bigger scale and more from a analysis and directorial viewpoint than the narrow lens I look through it. So yeah. Casey, it's all yours.
Thanks, Brad. My name is Casey, she, her. I first started reading Shakespeare in high school. They had us do a Shakespeare every year in English class. And then when I got to college, I was Juliet in Romeo and Juliet. And my claim to fame in that is that my Romeo forgot the dagger for the final scene. So I had to improv the whole last scene and kill myself creatively. And so I did that, and then directed the Scottish play in 2018 here, which is still like one of the hallmark shows that everyone looks at and goes, maybe one day we'll do another Macbeth, which I think is really cool, that they loved it that much. But my relationship to him is a lot more like high school academic and then self-taught, because my bachelor's is in musical theater, so I never had to take a Shakespeare class in my bachelor's, and then in my master's degree I didn't take any Shakespeare either. So I'm looking forward to soaking it up in a more academic sense, but theatrically rather than as literature. And if I could choose a character to play, I would play Macduff. But the character that I am is probably Aeschylus in R&J, because all he does is go, "What are you doing? Stop that. Cut that out. Don't do that anymore." And I feel like that's I have 4 kids, and then I'm the only faculty member with 25 students. And I feel like all I'm doing is going, no, what are you doing? Why would you do that? All the time. So is Joshua still needing to go?
Yeah.
I do, yes. I'm Josh, he, him. I didn't really hear all the questions, but I'm assuming they are first experience with Shakespeare. And my first one would be, I was a part of the apprentice company at the Kentucky Shakespeare Festival when I was like about 15 years old. And I remember climbing the lighting grid, and I did get the only speaking line for an apprentice for the season. Big claim to fame. I got the one line. And then I really haven't really seen a whole lot of musical theater performer. I started as originally and a set designer as well, and now a teacher. And but I have directed John Ford's Love's Sacrifice. I don't know if anyone knows that, but that is like it was amazing to direct, because it's like R&J, except there are like 5 deaths in the end or something like that. It was crazy. And I have directed an R&J. Anything else? Did I miss a question?
Just what do you want to learn, Joshua?
What do I want to learn? I looked at the syllabus, and I love that your mission is to demystify a lot of the myths about directing Shakespeare. And so I'm here to learn like what those myths are, and like I want to just feel really confident in the room when I'm working on scenes as a director and working on directing and conceptualizing a Shakespeare play.
Great. Awesome. Thank you. Hey, Jesse. We're doing a little check-in. I just popped the prompts in the chat for you. And I think it's down to you.
Oh, it's me?
Yep.
All right.
No pressure. I know you just got here.
No problem. No problem. Hello, my name is Jesse Parr. I am him, his pronouns, and my relationship to Shakespeare is ongoing, and it's complicated. I love Shakespeare. I'm a diehard Shakespeare fan. I have the Folgers collection. It's slowly growing of plays. I only chose Folgers because my favorite theater teacher in my bachelor's loved Folgers. That's the only reason why I chose it. But I love Shakespeare. I love reading Shakespeare. I love performing Shakespeare. I love directing Shakespeare. I just can't get enough of him. I actually tried teaching him to 7th graders. That's how much I love Shakespeare. If I was a Shakespeare character, I'd probably say Guildenstern, because he's an idiot. And oh gosh, I will eat anything up Shakespeare related. So so whatever we learn in this class, I will say that I've browsed the syllabus a couple times, and I'm not sure if I understand what the core objective of the class is, but that was quick glances, because I didn't have time to sit down with it prolong, but anything Shakespeare. But I will say I have complicated thoughts and feelings about him as well, because I don't know. Other people's perspectives of Shakespeare is not the best perspective that they have, and it's also valid. And it's like, I understand why you would feel that way. I do feel the same way, being a Jew and seeing some of the characterizations he has of Jewish characters, women, how he portrays women, how he portrays characters of color. Like, it's complicated, and it's not always the best light that cast Shakespeare in. But it kind of like my feelings for H.P. Lovecraft, like, oh, he did awful things, but I still like his writing. Like, dang it, what do I do with that? So anyways, all done. I'm done.
Awesome. Thank you, Jesse. So the first thing I want to offer is wherever you're starting from is okay. No apologies are required for the plays you haven't read or the things you don't know. If you'd read all the plays and you knew all the things, this would be a complete waste of your time, right? So wherever you are is cool. And if you're here to do the work, you're enough to do the work, right? And we will figure it all out together. So the biggest bias that I probably have that I invite you to please gently call me in about is I might just take off because I am super passionate about this stuff. And I might need you to just go, hold on, what was that word? I don't even know what that word means. Or you made a joke and I don't get the reference to that joke because I haven't read that play. Can you just walk it back? So call me in on that. If I do, I'll do my best, but I can't always be held responsible once I get started talking about these things. So just a little piece of my background with this. My first master's degree is from the Shakespeare Institute in Stratford-upon-Avon. I was Fulbright Scholar in Shakespeare. So on my first day of grad school in Stratford, my tutor, who we're going to read a little bit over the course of the semester, John Jowett, taught a version of a class like this. His was totally focused on what he called dramatic literature. And this is definitely, I've pivoted towards the performative with this. But anyway, John started talking and he gave this lecture. It was about 2 hours long that first day. And it was super approachable and super accessible. It didn't assume any prior knowledge. And then at the end of those 2 hours of lecture, he handed out the syllabus. And I saw that there were 1,500 pages of reading to go with the lecture he had just given. And there was 1,100 pages of reading for the next class. So I was 2,700 pages behind in the reading after my first 2 hours. So I've tried really hard to build you a class where that cannot happen. But I will also say, if there's any topic that we come across that is really interesting to you and you want more, I have approximately 80 gajillion resources for you, right? So if there's a topic that you're like, oh yeah, that's the thing I want to dive into, let's have a conversation. And I can, in the words of Dr. Frankenfurter, I can give you more. So sort of to Jesse's question, let me pull this up. Where'd it go? There it is. This ain't your grandma's drama lit class. This is scarcely a drama lit class at all. So if you came, I mean, we'll get into some interpretive questions, but a lot of what we're talking about is information that as somebody who's going to stage one of these plays or who's going to perform in one of these plays, you really ought to have, and nobody's taken the trouble to give you before, right? So some of that's about how you read a particular play, but we're kind of go in the Wayback Machine to a whole bunch of stuff that you should know before that. So when I say the text underneath, one of the things I'm talking about is, what do we mean by the text? So we'll come back to that question in a minute. I want to just do a couple other sort of housekeeping sorts of things first, and then we'll we'll get into those kinds of questions about what do we mean by the text of Shakespeare. So I just want to talk about, this will be a familiar concept if you've already been in class with me this week, but I just want to talk about the concept of access needs. Having needs is something that we all have, right? Everybody has something that we need. That should not make you difficult to work with. That just means you're human. So you can feel free to pop these in the chat if you like today. And we'll do it as part of our check-in, whatever your access needs are. You might say access needs might be a physical issue. Like for me, I'm standing right now, but I need to stand and sit. It's a 3-hour class. I can't be in one place that whole time. Or my back will scream at me for the whole weekend. So I move up and down a lot, but I don't need to, my access need gets met, right? What you'll probably notice is my desk lowers or comes back up again, right? You might have an access need like Liam's got children screaming in a basement, so he might not have his camera on, right? Or you might have elder care issues. You might just have a sensory challenge, or you need to take a break. You might need to turn your camera off sometimes. You can tell us what your access need is. You do not need to justify your access need. It is none of our business, right? I need to turn my camera off. If you want to tell us the why, we're happy to hear it, but it's also none of our business. So you don't need to disclose that if you don't want to. So you might say my access needs are whatever they are. My access needs are being met, or I'm tending to my access needs. Yeah. I think the whole American theater would be a better place if we remembered that everybody has some needs. So just want to throw that out there. Any questions about access needs? Everybody good so far? Awesome. Okay. So let's talk about group agreements. So I just want to, I don't think we're talking about things that are too controversial in this. Well, I don't know. I guess it depends. If you think the Earl of Oxford wrote Shakespeare, then you're going to be really pissed off. But just how do we want to be with one another, and what do you need in order to be as successful as possible in the class, right? So these are sort of the needs that I started with, the things that I know that I need from each of you, right? I need you to keep in touch with me, especially those of you who are not actually on the Zoom with us right now, who are going to be asynchronous. Please do not disappear into the wilderness and surface right after Thanksgiving. Keep me posted. We'll have every week, I'm going to post a discussion question on Canvas. Everybody is invited to join in on that discussion when you have time and capacity. I would say, especially those of you who are asynchronous, it's a great way to keep in touch with your comrades who are here in the room right now. But let us know what's going on. Yeah, so, and again, I don't need all the details. If you want to share details, that's great, that's fine. But if you're going to miss class, or if you're running late, if you can just let me know so I don't worry. Yeah, that's helpful. I guess that's an access need of mine. I need to know a little bit about what's going on. Speak from your own experience. I will try to speak from my own experience. Share the temporal real estate. What I mean by that is monitor your participation. Especially the first part of this class is a little more lecture-y because I have to just share some foundational knowledge, right? And then by about a third of the way into the semester, it gets much more debate and discuss once we establish some baselines, right? So I encourage everybody's participation, but I would also just ask you to monitor if you're talking a lot and other people aren't, maybe hold back a little bit. See if you can hold some space for other people to jump in. Does that seem reasonable, fair, doable? Sweet, okay. And then this has come up a couple times this week. So just the idea that it is okay to speak in rough draft, or in Shakespearean terms, authorial manuscript. That's just me being nerdy one more time. But rough draft meaning you don't have to have the whole thing perfectly solved. You can sort of say what you need to say, backtrack, rewind, revise, right? Shakespeare revised all the time. We're going to spend like a month on how much revision was going on in these plays. So if it was good enough for him, I dare say it's good enough for all of us groundlings here in the pit. Assume good intent, but also recognize impact. Yeah, so let's give each other the benefit of the doubt if we can, but also if you put your foot in it, just acknowledge it and apologize. Yeah, move forward. And then this is a 3-hour class. So I imagine we would like a break of some kind. Do we want like 1 10-minute break? Do we want 2 shorter 5-minute breaks? What makes you happy? Casey says 110. Noah has a thumbs up for that, either or 10. Okay. Everybody good with a 10-minute break somewhere in the middle-ish, wherever it makes the most sense on any given? Cool. Okay. Awesome. So anything else that you want to put on this list of things that you need in order for good? Gosh, that was easy. Grad seminar. It took us like 40 minutes to get through this yesterday. Sweet. Okay. So did y'all get a chance to watch that little clip from Shakespeare in Love? Is that a film you'd seen before, or was that new? A little bit of both. Okay. What came up for you as you watched that? Why did I ask you to watch that clip? Aside from all the scenery chewing that's going on in that. Yeah, Casey.
I think for me, because I've never seen it before, just the like dynamicism, like of everything that's going on, and the I'm sure ways in which it could be frustrating, but the way in which everyone in the community is like taking major part in what's going on around them, I thought was really fascinating. Like, I would rather have to deal with all of that than everyone being silent at the beginning of a rehearsal. Do you know what I mean? Like, everyone is so active in the work. I thought that was interesting.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I thought Ben Affleck's accent was suspect at best.
It was Keanu-like, really.
Yeah. Kevin Costner and Robin Hood, that kind of thing. The thing that always stands out to me in that scene is the ego, is how everyone needs to find their place in the production. And that is, unfortunately, has continued since that time.
For sure.
Yeah, I'll add to that. Oh, I'm so sorry. Who else was going to go?
Go ahead, Noah. You're good.
I was just going to say, I wanted to mirror what Brad just said, which is everybody in that scene thought their part was the most important part, except for the person who was writing, who continually got kind of shut down. And his voice wasn't heard, even though those are the words they're all going to speak and uplift as producers, et cetera, et cetera. And so, yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Great, thank you. Lauren, hold that thought for 1 sec. Just a super quick survey. How many of you know who, and this is just, I'm just level setting here, right? How many of you know who Philip Henslowe was? Is that a name you've heard before? Okay, great. Jeffrey Rush is playing the part of Philip Henslowe, who is a real guy in Shakespeare in Love. And we're gonna read a little bit of Philip Henslowe's diary. Thank God he kept good notes, because we know all kinds of things about what was happening in the Elizabethan Playhouse because Philip Henslowe kept a diary. Lauren, what you thinking?
I really liked the line, "Well, I'm the money." And the step back of, I was going to give this big, and then suddenly, oh, nope, here's my place. I appreciated that.
Yeah. Some things apparently never change. So I want to really uplift also what Autumn has thrown in the chat, because Autumn has cut straight to the chase. Who's that? The author. He doesn't matter. So in the first part of Shakespeare's career, his name, when his plays were printed, his name did not appear on the title page. Noah, what you thinking?
I also just feel it would be remiss, and I know that this is a big structural plot point of the movie, but it's all men in this
Well,
conversation.
well,
And
yeah.
I think it's still true today with Shakespeare. Like so many times I've encountered, going into a rehearsal process, and almost every single person a part of the production team is male. And it's very bizarre. I'm like, we're doing X play and yet it's all men. Why? So
Yeah.
I just think it's important to call out.
Yeah. Yeah, Jesse, what are you thinking? Where'd you go? Oh, Jesse, you're on mute, doll.
Oops, forgive me. I'm new to Zoom, so I was just saying I remember watching on the conversation of big personalities and ignoring the author. I remember watching a video of David Mamet talking about the first time he had his play produced professionally, and the actors in front of him were arguing about what a line meant, and he said that he's gone on to become this, like, the person that says that the playwright's the most important person in the room, but it was just like this moment of they were all ignoring the author because he wasn't this well-known person, and now David Mamet's one of the leading like teachers of playwriting and whatnot, and so it's like it's very interesting. Well, I didn't say he was good, no, but I don't know. I just found that interesting. It's like Noah said it already. Not much has changed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So yeah, so what does it mean to be the author? Yeah, Lauren.
I thought up these words and wrote them on the paper and put them in the order. Here they are. They're yours. They're mine, but they're yours.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just that makes me think of something I scribbled down, which was there's a curation piece to authorship, I think, as well. Just someone who has written in the past, here's what I wrote down on the piece of paper. Here's what the actor is saying. What they're saying is different, but I like it. I'm going to use that and change. Like there's a little bit of a back and forth, but there's the curation part, I think, as well.
Yeah, there's some messiness even now about what it means to be the author of a play, right? And the original cast of Hamilton all got royalties for their contributions to Lin-Manuel Miranda's play, right? So we have an idea of authorship now in the 21st century that did not exist in the Elizabethan and the Jacobean world, right? So all of that messiness that Brad was just talking about was true then as it is now. And we're going to talk about and this is part of what I mean by the text underneath, right? Because so many people had their fingers on these plays before they made it into print. And then before they made it from print into Jesse's Folger editions, right? Or your Arden or your New Cambridge or your Oxford, whatever modern edition you like, right? All kinds of people have made changes, and most of them are invisible to us. And this is sort of at the heart of what this class is about, because I feel like as theater practitioners working on these plays, we should understand a lot of those invisible choices that got made for us, right? Yeah, I see. I also want to acknowledge what Becky is throwing in the chat about, in the sense of Shakespeare, it's still debated if he was the author and that we don't know if he was one person or many. I actually think the evidence is overwhelming that he was one dude, but and that one guy mostly wrote the plays, but he was in partnership with 8 other men who were his in his company with him, and all of them were making changes and giving him feedback, right? You get, if you watch all of Shakespeare in Love, you get a little bit of sense of that from Ben Affleck and his very fine accent giving feedback to Joseph Fiennes. But also what we're going to learn is about what happened in the theater, that feedback, and then somehow, and the story is different with almost each of the plays. And I'm really glad that other people did this work, because it's a level of nerdery that I can only aspire to. People have spent their entire careers tracking how individual plays got from the playhouse to the printing house. And then what happened in the printing house, and how we got the original first printed text of these plays, right? And in some cases, we have multiple original texts. So which one is which, right? There are some folks in our business who talk about the first folio like, I don't know, like it's this magic book. Do we know, does everybody know what the first folio is when I say first folio? Is that a familiar phrase? Right, so we're going to spend a whole chunk of time with the folio, but essentially it was a collection of 36 of Shakespeare's plays that was put together several years after he died by 2 of his surviving company members, right? And they spent about 3 years working with a little company of printers to collect all the plays, because they did not own them. They did not have the rights to them. And so they had to collect them all together. And a couple of plays that we now take as given that they are Shakespeare were not included in the first folio. So I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but anyway, so how we got to that first text is a whole story by itself. And there are people walking around, there are people who teach these plays as if they are experts who have not done some of the work you're going to do this semester. And they talk about the capital letters in the first folio like they're the tooth fairy, right? Like there's some deep hidden meaning in the capital letters in the folio. And one of the things I'm here to do is debunk the tooth fairy of the first folio. There's no evidence for this idea that that was Shakespeare who said time should be capitalized there, and that therefore you should, I don't know, act the word differently because it starts with a capital T instead of a lowercase t. But that's a theory, and there's people who teach that. You know, if you want it to be real, you know, Santa's a nice idea, rock and roll, but understand the difference between the thing you wish were true and the actual true, right? And if it, and, you know, I would say, yeah, time. Thank you, Noah. If you as an actor working on one of those pieces of text want to look at the first folio and explore, see if it gives you a clue, that's nice. But that is not a message from Shakespeare. That is not Shakespeare telling you a thing. Oh yeah, firsty lovers. Yeah, Shakespeare and Company in Lenox, Massachusetts, which does their month-long actor training. Man, a lot of their training is really good, but Tina Packer, who is the founder of Shakespeare and Company and is this really important practitioner in this country, she is much more interested in a good story than she is in the bibliographical facts and the history. And where the history gets in the way of her good yarn, she just ignores it. So she's one of those people who loves those capital letters and also the punctuation in the first folio. And we're going to talk about that too, because that is not necessarily Shakespeare's punctuation. Anyway, I digress. See, this is what happens. So authorship in the late 16th and the early 17th century is not how we think of authorship now. Once a playwright wrote a play for a company, it did not belong to him anymore. And I say him because no women were allowed to write for the public companies, right? There were women writing, There were lots of women writing plays, but they knew that they were only going to be staged in private homes. So ownership of the play defaulted to the company which performed it, right? So the company got to decide what happened to that play, not the playwright, unless the playwright was a member of the company, which Shakespeare was, with the Lord Chamberlain's men first, and then in 1603, his company became sponsored by King James, and they became the King's Men, right? But Shakespeare, as a member of the company, had a little bit more say about what happened to his text once he wrote it. But still, there's a whole bunch of people. There is not a class for women playwrights of the Elizabethan era, but I would love to teach that class. I will talk to Rob. So a theater bookkeeper, and the bookkeeper is not an accountant in the way that we think of the phrase bookkeeper now, but literally the keeper of the book, right? The bookkeeper, which was somewhere between a production stage manager, an assistant director, and a musical conductor, if you kind of think of some of the tasks that each of those people do. The keeper of the book would annotate the script. They might add stage directions, calls for music. They would clarify entrances and exits. They might anticipate action by moving entrances up or about presetting, people in certain places or business. They might change speech headings. They might make cuts. They might mark certain passages for omission. That copy of the script that the keeper of the book had became the source also for the actors' parts or roles, because the actors did not get the whole script. They got their part and they got a couple of keywords. And it was a bunch of pieces of paper pasted together and then rolled up. And that's why an actor's part is called a role, because you would get handed your role. And then you would open it. And when you heard the keyword, you said your speech, right? We also have evidence, as I said before, of lots of revision of the plays. Usually when the play was being revived, sometimes they would spruce it up a little bit. They might call in the original playwright to dust it off and make it a little more topical and current, but they might not. They might ask somebody else to do it. So there's a lot of what I like to call textual intercourse going on, because there's a lot of hands. So when you say, who wrote Shakespeare? To me, it's not a question of, is it the Earl of Oxford or some such nonsense, because that is nonsense and I'm here to debunk it. But what is more true is Shakespeare wrote the play, but then maybe Thomas Middleton came in and made some changes, like with Macbeth and with Measure for Measure. Thomas Middleton revised those plays before they ever made it into print. So the only versions we have of Macbeth and Measure for Measure are the versions that Thomas Middleton has revised. At the time, that was called botching. Botching didn't have the connotation that it does now. Like botching now, right? It sounds like you screwed it up. But a botcher at the time was just somebody who was hired to make some changes. So Middleton was the botcher on Measure and Macbeth. There are 18 plays of Shakespeare that were never printed during his lifetime. So the first time they were printed was in that first folio in 1623, 7 years after he died. So the final decision about what text went into the folio was not his. And in fact, we have almost no evidence that he was invested in getting his plays printed, right? He was really interested in getting his lyric poetry printed. He worked very specifically with another guy from his hometown, Stratford-upon-Avon, named Richard Fields, who was a printer in London. He took great care to get his lyric poetry printed. He never showed, there's no evidence that he was involved in the printing of any of the plays. So a big chunk of what we're going to do in this class is what's called bibliography. Who knew that bibliography was something besides that list of sources at the back of your paper? That was news to me when I started down this road. So bibliography is actually a whole field of study about sort of it's the study of the text, right? And so we're going to look a lot at what is the text? What do we mean by the text? Whose mitts have been on the text? Yeah. Is there anybody who's now ready to run away, whose enthusiasm has completely been sapped by what I've just said? Josh is like, I'm out of here. Peace out.
I'm totally kidding. I'm fascinated. It's amazing.
Okay. I just want to make, and also the note, if you feel like now that you've heard that, this is not what it came for, that's cool. I don't want to waste your time if you thought you were coming to a more traditional drama lit class, but that's not what we're doing. Yeah. So I'm going to tell you so many things, where to start. Let's go here. Yes, Lauren, what's up?
Can I ask a process recommendation question?
Sure.
So just for like I've bounced through the canvas. Is it your recommendation that in the first third of the course, when what we're getting is foundational lecturer-ish content, that we take and keep notes? Are you going to upload the content that you read from or share from to Canvas? Are we pulling stuff out? Do you have a preference for how we keep up with this information?
You know, I don't have a preference because everybody learns in different ways. So I will certainly share all of the PowerPoints to Canvas as we go. But like today's PowerPoint is mostly a lot of pictures and a couple of quotes. So I'll put it up there. But if you missed something in the notes, I'm not sure that it will by itself. I don't tend to make PowerPoints that are super text heavy. Here's all the bullet points, because I think PowerPoints like that make us stupid.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. Yeah.
So yeah, take notes if that is helpful. If I'm going too fast, tell me to slow the F down. And I will do my best. Yeah. So we're going to start the course by talking about the early modern playhouse, right? So this is a line drawing of what we think the globe probably looked like. You can see that it's kind of a thrust stage. And there was audience on about 16 sides. It looks like a circle when you see it from the outside, but it's actually a 16-sided building, not a circle. Yeah. There would often be dudes on stage, bros on stage watching the play. And they were mostly there. I mean, they were there to watch the play, but they're also there to be seen watching the play, right? So it was a very kind of social thing. So those guys would be, can you see my cursor? Right? They would be sort of up here in this gallery space over the stage, which is actually a pretty crap location to watch the play from, right? But it's a great place to be seen from. And then you've got, you know, the cheapest ticket was down here in the yard. And you paid a penny to stand in the yard. Those guys are called the groundlings. And then you have galleries that go all the way around the theater, right? Let me show you. So, come on. I know it's a little hard to see in this picture, but this is a drawing called The Long View of London by a guy named Wenceslas Halle. And it's what London looked like before the Great Fire in 1666. He's actually mislabeled the Globe Theater and the bear baiting ring. And so the Globe, which I've circled in this purple line, is labeled bear baiting. Does anybody not know what bear baiting is? Because I feel like, yeah. So bear baiting was, Casey, considered a really cool way to spend your afternoon in Elizabethan England. They literally chained a bear to a stake and then they like sicked dogs on the bear. Yeah. Yeah, PETA would not be amused. So the bear baiting ring looked a lot from the outside. It looked very similar to the theater. or to the playing spaces. Yeah, right. I mean, it's not bear baiting, it's different from, but it's not that different from like some of the things we do to dogs and chickens in certain kinds of, shall we say, periphery sport activities. I don't know. Anyway, so the bear baiting is actually over here closer to the river, and the globe is here. And as I say, it looks like a circle, but in fact, it's like a 16-sided building. So Brad Lemons, would you read us this quote, please?
Certainly. When these comedies or tragedies were presented on the stage, the actors omitted some scenes and passages with the author's consent as occasion led them. But now you have both all that was acted and all that was not.
Great, thank you.
You're
So this is when Beaumont and Fletcher were a playwriting team, kind of a Rodgers and Hammerstein of the period. John Fletcher also co-authored a couple of plays with Shakespeare. He wrote part of Timon of Athens. He probably wrote part of Two Noble Kinsmen. But when Beaumont and Fletcher's works were all gathered together for the first time, this comment was on sort of the prefatory pages at the beginning of this book that gathered all their plays together. So what part of they were telling us, right, that the actors made cuts, right? And that there's stuff that they wrote that didn't get performed in the Playhouse. But as they're creating the book, they want it all in there. Yeah. Josh, would you read this, please?
There be them that will get jests by heart, that have gathered a commonplace book out of plays, that will not let a merriment slip, but they will truss it up for their own provision.
Yeah. So one of the things that happens in the Playhouse is that a lot of people come, and as they're listening to the play, they've got a pencil or a piece of charcoal, and they're taking some notes while they're watching the play. And so if they hear like a really good line, they write it down. And then when they are wooing a girl, they've got this really cool phrase that they can use while they're hitting on the lady. Or if they go back to the Inns of Court, if they're lawyers who've taken the afternoon off, they can put that phrase into the brief that they're presenting at court, right? We do some version of this now, right? You hear a really cool line in a show or in a film, and you know, leave the gun and take the cannoli, right? They were doing the same thing. But the fact that there was a bunch of people in the Playhouse taking notes is going to be important later. Yeah, so just file that piece of information away. Thomas Dekker, if you don't know, is a playwright who is a contemporary of Shakespeare's. Thomas Dekker, Thomas Middleton, Fletcher and Beaumont, Henry Chettle. If these guys, you're going to need a bigger folio. If you don't know these guys' names, it's only because Shakespeare honestly was so big that he eclipsed all of them. Thomas Middleton is a really good playwright, and we would be doing Thomas Middleton plays all the time right now if it wasn't for the fact of Shakespeare, right? This was an incredibly prolific time that all of these guys were writing in, and so much goodness, so much good stuff. Yeah. I think I got one more. Yeah, so Lauren, would you read us this quote from Francis Beaumont in the prologue to his play, The Woman Hater?
Yes. If there be any lurking amongst you in corners with table books, who have some hope to find fit matter to feed his malice on, let them clasp up and slink away.
Yeah, so what do you think that means?
Stop stealing our scripts.
Yeah. And he's specifically saying not only stop stealing our stuff, which again is like reinforcing what the Thomas Dekker quote was also saying, right? But he's also saying other people are taking notes of things they really hate so that they can go bitch about the plays, right? So they can go to the tavern or the pub and be like, whew, did you see that stinker by Francis Beaumont? That thing that happened in Act 2, right? So it's early modern social media, right? Oh, let's come back to him in a minute. Sorry, Simon Callow, go away. Okay, so we started to talk about this a little bit. Becky kind of posed the question a little bit in the chat, but what do we mean by Shakespeare? Lauren, is that a legacy hand or was that a?
It's a new question, which you might or might not have the answer to. What's the average literature like literacy rate in like, who does everybody write? Is everybody, I mean, you're saying we've got a bunch of people in the audience taking notes,
yeah, and
people saying, hey, stop stealing our stuff. Do we have a mostly literate populace? I feel like I didn't think we did.
Well, so I think the received idea is that almost everybody was illiterate. And the truth, and Tiffany Stern has done a lot of research on this. She's a scholar. I would say that it's about 50-50. That there's a section of the audience that is highly literate and is taking a lot of notes and are interacting with the text in a few different ways, right? And then there's an illiterate audience that is probably mostly the folks who are standing in the pit who can only pay the penny, right? Because they're more working class. They might be, apprentices, or they might be craftsmen who don't need to read for their work, right? And so you have a mix of people, and there are some jokes for everybody, right? There are some jokes that are just for the people who read. There are some jokes that are specifically for the folks who don't read. There are jokes at the expense of certainly each of those groups of people. And then there's stuff that everybody will find funny, right? So I have been working with incarcerated men for about 15 years, and we do a lot of Shakespeare behind the walls. And I would say that that's a place where I can really track, right? Like when we perform for the incarcerated audience, there's stuff that's only funny to them. And then when the civilian audience comes in to watch the play, they're weeping at some of the things that the men were laughing at. And then there's stuff that the outside audience, the civilian audience, is laughing their heads off that the men didn't really react to. And then there's stuff that everybody finds funny. And I think that's a version of something similar, if that makes any sense. So yeah, so what does Shakespeare mean? Shakespeare.
I think it means anything that we have attributed to him. Doesn't necessarily mean he had his hand in it, but he was there when it was happening.
Okay. Yeah, Noah, and then Jesse.
Yeah, I think in a broad sense, Shakespeare is just that. It's what people think of as classical. And I know that in our context, we'll be going deeper, but I have students who sometimes you'll say Shakespeare and they think anything pre-1900s. They just think classical or elevated verse text. But for me, to be more specific and more in line, I think of Shakespeare as anything that, as someone else said, attributed to his name, but also moreover, a certain style of play in that time. So there are times where I get confused. Oh, is that, oh gosh, what's his bucket ice pick guy? Marlowe, there we go. But in that similar style. So yeah.
Ice bucket guy.
Ice pick through the guy.
A great reckoning in a small room. Yeah, Jesse.
I really only have to agree with Becky and Noah. When I think of Shakespeare, I think of a lot of things that he's attributed to him. We have entire genres dedicated to him. I like to read critics and descriptions of modern day playwrights, and a common thing you see is that if a play has a large sense of tragedy or an Elizabethan idea of comedy, it's considered Shakespearean. Yeah, so it's now become like a style of writing too, like a genre.
Yeah, there's only a handful of playwrights who get their own adjectives, right? There's we get things that are Brechtian or Chekhovian, and of course Shakespearean. Drives me a little nutty sometimes when the news media starts to talk about some political thing and they say, oh, the scope of this is Shakespearean. And I think, oh, when was the last time any of you read one of the plays? Autumn and then Casey.
I think in just a like purely tangible way, I think that Shakespeare kind of recognizes or represents a divide amongst people, what they feel is accessible to them and what is not. So academically, I'm with all of you about who it represents and what he's written and blah blah blah. But I think in contemporary understanding, and especially in like, I work with a lot of lower income students, or free or reduced lunch. That's the way we determine it. And not many of those students feel that Shakespeare is even something they can access. So I think it very functionally represents a political and or people divide right now. But I could be wrong, and maybe that's changing, and maybe this class will change everything. Who knows?
No, I don't think you're wrong. I would say the way I think of what you're describing, Autumn, is Shakespeare as cultural church, right? That there's this idea. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, for sure, as a person who grew up in the church.
And also I tend to think of him sometimes as theatrical oat bran. Like we treat him like he is just good for you, right? And if you don't get it, it's sort of your problem. But if you just come to the Church of Shakespeare and, open the prayer book, you will be benefited by it. And that makes for some of the worst performances. So there's a Shakespeare industry. There's Shakespeare as cultural church. Casey, what are you thinking?
When I think about Shakespeare, there were a couple of things that popped into my mind. One is that he just tends to be the standard by which we measure everything else.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not only plays, but certainly plays, and especially plays written by his contemporaries. But, I think I can't remember who was mentioning before, like, it's an adjective. It's it's no Shakespearean tragedy, or, it's not Romeo and Juliet, or it is Romeo and Juliet. It's like this, like we compare and we measure everything against so many of his plays. And the other thing that I think is really interesting is that you've got a group of people who would call Shakespeare's plays universal, that they have all these universal themes that everyone can identify with, and you can see yourself in his plays, which, is debatable in a lot of ways, but like, it is universal. And then on the same hand is totally not accessible. So I just think it's an interesting, like, it's for everyone and it's for no one at all, unless you're of this certain elite group of people.
Yeah. So a thing happened to Shakespeare. So, hey, sorry, Noah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to throw a bit of conjecture in that because I've been hearing that a lot lately, that Shakespeare isn't for everyone. And I think, yes, and I would offer that I think what a lot of people mean with that statement and don't clarify is that Shakespeare's themes are for everyone. And thematically, like, they touch on things of the human condition, which can be said for, all theatrical events. But I think, as you said, like, the language, the inherent racism, all of that, yes, not accessible. But I think that I guess what I struggle with in academia is how to artfully make that distinction, because it's been so shoved down my throat that Shakespeare is for everyone with big air quotes. But like, I think that statement used to be well-intentioned, and now, because we've grown so much, how do we Kate always says it so well, and I don't know how to say it like you do, Kate. A reframe. How do we reframe what we mean by that? So I just wanted to offer that into the conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Noah. I think two things come up for me about that, right? One is I think he is for everyone, and I know that is a politically problematic thing to say, but like I said, I have been working in maximum security environments on these plays for 15 years, and in part because and it is problematic, and Jesse was quite right to point out the misogyny and the racism, and those things are all true. And we can love Shakespeare and acknowledge those things and tease them out in production, right? You don't have to ignore them. You don't have to just cut them. Although you might make the choice to cut them. My issue is make sure that you're making informed choices about what you're cutting and not just cutting the stuff you don't like or the stuff you don't understand, which is mostly what happens. Dan Sullivan drives me bonkers. But anyway, I think he is for everyone, and in part because he is culture church, right? For good and for ill, like that's problematic in lots of ways, right? But one of the things that I observe in carceral spaces is because a lot of the men with whom I work have been told their whole lives that they are stupid, that they are thugs, that they are monsters, that they are garbage, right? They have been dehumanized, and many of them have internalized those messages. And it's part of the reason that they have ended up where they are, right? Because a whole set of systems and structures has failed them, right? And they won't go to the GED classes or to the associate's degree program because they think school is not for them because they have been told they are stupid and now they believe it, right? But they'll come to the theater class because we're making a lot of silly noises and we're jumping up and down and we're beating on each other with air broadswords. And then they stand up and they do Macbeth or Measure for Measure or 12th Night in front of 600 Class A felons, which is a tough crowd, right? They're going to let you know if they're bored. And what happens over and over, I've seen it happen over and over and over again, that a guy who, when he first comes into that room, cannot make eye contact, can't get his hands out of his pockets, mumbles, swallows all of his words. After he's done some Shakespeare, he goes, oh, maybe I'm not as stupid as I thought I was. Oh, I'm gonna go to the GED program, right? And the recidivism rate for guys who get their 4-year degree while they're incarcerated is 0%. They do not return to prison. It is the prison to education pipeline, right? And if instead of like problematizing mostly Black and brown boys in 4th grade, if they're not doing well on a standardized test at that point, if we instead grabbed them up and said, come on, let's do a play, I think a lot of them would not end up in my program. So he's super problematic. He's also awesome. And I think the thing about Shakespeare and the reason why we shouldn't throw him away in spite of the racism and the sexism and everything else is because he asks us over and over and over again, what does it mean to be human? How should we act? What should we do? And he shows us the full range of humanity, right? As he does that. So yeah, super problematic. The question of universal makes me cringe a little bit because it is so hetero, patriarchal, all those things. I don't think we need that phrase, but I think he can, if he's taught right, he can invite a lot of people in. Yeah, Josh.
I think what is universal is the music of it. I think the music and the rhythm and the organization of it and how it's patterned like music is universal. I think everyone can feel that with and hear it and sense it in their first encounter. And so I think that is something that's universal about Shakespeare.
Yeah. Yeah. Lauren, I take your point too about, yeah, if you encounter Shakespeare for the first time in 9th grade English class from a teacher who doesn't quite get it, it can destroy your relationship to Shakespeare for the rest of your life. Or if the first time you see a production of Shakespeare, when I was in grad school at the Shakespeare Institute, the Royal Shakespeare Company was right down this block, right? So we went to a lot of rehearsals, but they were having a terrible season. Most of the productions that year were terrible, right? It was near the end of Adrian Noble's tenure as artistic director, and the plays were awful. And I would watch these bus loads of Americans, right, who had driven up and they had arrived in Shakespeare Mecca, right? And they dutifully went to the play, and the plays were terrible. And they walked away thinking they were stupid because they didn't get it. And I think that, to me, like the moral indictment on the theater company for making their audience feel stupid because they failed to stage a viable production of the play just made me, yes, Adrian Noble, so many thoughts, Fred. Means that folks come to me with, I don't like plays. Yeah, right. Oh, what a shame. Yeah. Cool. Why don't we take a 10-minute break and come back at 39 minutes after whatever hour it is for you. And we'll go from there. Yeah. Welcome back, y'all. Looks like a couple people I know took off. They're taking both this class and Sarah's Foundations of American Theater class at the same time, which is a bold choice. So they're gonna split their time back and forth a little bit. But yeah, so here we are. Or I scared their socks off and they went running is also a possibility. In this, just coming back to this, what does Shakespeare mean question, right? So for about 300 years from the time of really the restoration of the theaters in England after the English Civil War till about 1900 roughly, what critics and editors were trying to do was to pin down as precisely as they could, this is Shakespeare, right? They wanted to put a box around it. And a lot of what the editors did, the first editors of Shakespeare in the 17th and 18th centuries did, was they looked at all the surviving texts at the time and they said, essentially, we want all the good bits that we know are Shakespeare. And so if there's, in the case of a play like King Lear, where we have two substantively different texts, right? There was one printed in 1608, and there was one printed in that folio in 1623. Those are different plays, people. They have all the same characters in them, but there's whole chunks of things missing from one that are in the other, right? Somebody revised that play. If it wasn't Shakespeare, it was somebody in his company who was very familiar with his style, because it's not like they just slashed and burned, like they're very thoughtful cuts and some very thoughtful changes. But what happened for hundreds of years was that the critics and the editors were saying, no, we want all the good bits, right? And so they took all the things that they thought were good from that 1608 Lear, and they took all the things that they thought were good from the 1623 Lear, and they mashed them together. And the technical term for that editorial mashing together is called conflation. So that's a word to write down if it's a new one for you. With several of the plays, until very recently, all you had were conflated texts. So if you have like the second edition of the Arden, hold on, I have a visual demonstration. Where'd you go?
Kate, while you're doing that, what are your thoughts on the Riverside?
I mean, David Bevington, the editor of the Riverside, I mean, it's complicated because Bevington's a good guy. He's a smart guy. We're going to read some stuff by Bevington this semester. The guys who are the general editors of the Oxford are good guys, smart, thoughtful editors.
I feel a but's coming on.
I just think, well, it's just complicated because the editor, the general editor of an edition like the Oxford or the New Cambridge or the Arden sets a bunch of kind of guiding principles for the editors of each individual text, right? But David Bevington, who's the general editor of the Riverside, didn't actually make all the editorial decisions in each individual play. He's sort of jobbed that out to a bunch of different people, right? So like the second edition of the Arden, King Lear, was edited by R.A. Folks, right? And then in 1980, and Folks, like every bibliographer, every editor for 300 years said, I want all the good bits. And so I'm taking the stuff from the 1608 Lear and I'm taking the stuff from the 1623 Lear and I'm mashing them together, right? And then what you get is sort of hard to see, but I'm sure you've all seen some version of this, right? But down at the bottom of the page, right, there's this sort of inscrutable gobbledygook, right? There's like, here's the part where maybe we're defining some vocabulary that you're not familiar with, or maybe we're saying, oh, this word gets used this way in another one of Shakespeare's plays, so here it probably means this, right? But then there's this stuff, right? This gobbledygook down here has a name. Its name is Steve. No, its name is the collation line, right? This is called the collation line. Barry Kraft, who was the dramaturg at Oregon Shakespeare Festival for a lot of years, called it the strip of terror. Because mostly nobody ever teaches you how to read the collation line. And I just picked a page at random, right? So on page 172, Act 1, Scene 1, line 196, it says, line 199, ought, Q, F, ought. So if you don't know what Q and F mean, does that help you to hear the difference between, and I'll just put the words in the chat because they're homonyms, but they mean different things, right? Is it ought? Maybe it's that, right? That's what we call a textual crux. That's a phrase that's going to come up a lot too. One of the most famous textual cruxes is in Hamlet, because we have 3 different Hamlet plays, right? Oh boy, those are different plays, people. But again, for 300 years, mostly what the editors have done is go, oh, we want all the good bits, right? Let's keep all the good bits. Collation, the collation line, yeah. And so collation is telling you, if you think about what it means to collate, right? When you're standing at your photocopier, right? You want to make sure that in each copy, things are in the right order, right? And so the collation is we're taking the bits from the quarto and the bits from the folio, or the bits from, you might think of the quartos as sort of the paperback version, right? And the folio is like the hardback in a way. We want the good bits from all of it. So the collation line is kind of explaining the choices that the editor has made, right? So the most famous of these is in Hamlet. And, or one of the most famous of these lines is when Hamlet says, oh, that this too sullied flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew. Or, oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew. Or, just to complicate it, the third version is, oh, that this too sallied flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew. So our choices are solid, sullied, and sallied. Sallied is probably a typo. It's probably a printing house error. But sullied does something from an acting point of view, right? If you think about, if you're describing your own flesh as sullied, think about the muscularity. Like just say that word out loud to yourself, you know, sullied, right? It's corrupted, it's tainted. Yes, when you have a choice between different versions, and especially when it comes to a single word or a phrase, Casey, then that's called a textual crux, right? And so that sullied solid is one of the most famous of the textual cruxes. They're everywhere. And some of them are where you've got these issues between, we've got 2 authoritative texts, right? Like in the case of King Lear, or we have 3 authoritative texts in the case of Hamlet. And sometimes you get a textual crux because there was something in that original text that probably didn't make sense, probably was a typo. And one of the first editors, a guy named Malone in the 17th century, made a choice about what he thought it was supposed to be. And then every editor that came after Malone had to make a choice. Did they agree with Malone? Or did they think it was something else? And in some editions of the plays where they have all the notes from every critic and every editor who's ever weighed in, you can watch these guys fight with each other over the course of hundreds of years, right? And it gets personal. Like at some points they're like, that Malone, he's like screwed in the head. I can't believe he thinks it's this, right? Well, Warburton, blah, blah, blah. And they're having a little cat fight, yeah. But so when we talk about this idea of what is the text, and this question of the text underneath, right? What is the text? Is it what's in a document? Or is it an underlying set of ideas? Is it the text Shakespeare wrote? Is it the text that his collaborators in the theater helped him refine? What's the text? Liam, you made a face. What are you thinking?
No, my mind's just being blown. That's all. That's
I
it.
love it when I can do that on the first day. Yeah, sorry, Brad.
Do you have a preference, like one you use if you're working on something?
So the short answer is no. I tend to start with the Arden most of the time. By the end of this course, you're going to know who some of these individual editors are, and you're going to have your own opinions about some of them. And then you're going to go, oh, Stephen Orgel edited that, so no thanks. Or, oh, Paul Werstein edited that, let me add it. Right? Or you might have the opposite response. I'm not trying to prescribe. I'm just saying you're going to start to know who some of these editors are and about some of the choices, right? So Autumn is saying that the text is what floats around in the world's collective brain or collaborative brain as the story. Ah, yeah. So this gets back to cultural church a little bit, right? We have one other thing I wanted to say about that Shakespeare's for Everyone and that pop culture thing that we were talking about before the break is Shakespeare was pop culture in this country until about the turn of the 20th century. It was not culture church. Most of the wagons that made their way west, whatever else you want to say about white supremacy and manifest destiny and how troubled all of those things are, most of those wagons took two books with them. They took the King James Bible and they took the complete works of Shakespeare, right? And Mark Twain wouldn't have been able in Huckleberry Finn to make all the jokes about Richard III if he didn't know that his audience was going to find them hilarious because they all were familiar with Richard III, right? It was pop culture and people would stand on a wagon and read those plays or perform those plays around a campfire, right? What happens around 1900, give or take, is that the immigrants who start coming to the United States start to look different. And they're not native English speakers anymore. Or there are still native English speakers coming, but also now there's lots of Italians and there's lots of Germans and there's other people who are learning English once they get here. And that's when we start to get this divide of high culture and low culture. And Shakespeare starts to become, I mean, we had riots in the middle of the 19th century in New York City over which was the better production of a Shakespeare play, the Astor Place riots, right? The Bowery Boys were rioting about whether the Brit or the American performance in a particular Shakespeare play was the better one. So it was pop culture, but then when we get these immigrants who are not native English speakers starting to flood in, we start to get this divide, right? And that's when we start to get this, oh, Shakespeare, right? It's frightfully good for you. And it's high culture, it's culture, right? And then we have vaudeville and dancing girls and stuff, but I'm sorry, can you show me the Shakespeare play that doesn't have vaudeville and dancing girls in it? Right? So that divide comes pretty late. Yeah, anything we can do to create an in-group and an out-group. Exactly, Autumn, for sure. What's your question about John Barton, Liam?
How do you feel about playing Shakespeare? I'm assuming you've read it. How do you feel about that book?
It's great. It's great. John was the best.
Okay, great. I feel the same way.
Yeah.
Good.
John was, I mean, I'm not sure he was the best director, but he was a great acting coach. He's a very sweet guy. He, like his clothing, was kind of a comfy sweater. I got to do a couple workshops with him when I was in England. He was lovely. Yeah. 2 Bucks on the Wagon, is that where the phenomenon of Christian culture where people quote Shakespeare? Oh, yeah. So actually, Jesse, part of what happens, King James takes the throne in 1603, right? And he commissions a Bible in English instead of Latin. And he had, there's a book called God's Secretaries, if this is something you're interested in, because I know you all have copious spare time to be reading something else right now, but there's a book called God's Secretaries, and it details what happened there. So King James commissions like 37 scholars to translate the Bible into English. But he says two things to them. The first one is, can you make sure that as you translate the Bible into English, that you make kings really important and you make them the voice of God on earth in the way that you frame the story? Because that suited his needs, right? And then he also said, can you make it sound as much like that Shakespeare guy as possible? And that is why the King James Bible sounds a lot like Shakespeare, because that was deliberate. Yes, I am so full of Elizabethan trivia. You are going to win every bar bet by the time the semester is over. So yeah. So getting back to this question of what is the text, right? So the nature of authorship is unstable in the period, right? And now I'm here. So we have 300 years of editors and scholars who are trying to nail down, this is Shakespeare, right? And they're trying to say only these 36 plays that are in the first folio, that's Shakespeare, right? Except people go, they find some other text and they're like, oh, but this little section is really good. It couldn't possibly be that Thomas Middleton or Thomas Dekker wrote this. This must be Shakespeare, right? But there's no criteria except that they like it. Like the goodness is how they decide that it's Shakespeare, right? And then what starts to happen at the beginning of the 20th century is that the editors and the bibliographers start to go, this might be more complicated. And also they start to develop science around text, right? There's a whole field called stylometry. Yeah, there's a $10 Scrabble word right there, right? Stylometry. And stylometry, again, like, God bless the people who do this, because I'm glad for the knowledge they bring us. And I'm not sure I want to have dinner with them because they must have really narrow focus. But stylometry is looking at like the recurrence of certain words and phrases, certain turns of phrase in somebody's writing, and being able to analyze who's who. And it's part of how they've been able to identify in a play like Timon of Athens, where it's John Fletcher writing and where it's Shakespeare writing, right? It's part of how we were able to start to unpick where Thomas Middleton made changes in Measure for Measure. We'll talk more about Measure later. When I was in grad school, when I got really interested in all of the things, all the changes that we are pretty sure Middleton made. And so I thought, well, what happens if you take Middleton back out again? And so I edited a version of Measure for Measure where I pulled Middleton out. And I wouldn't presume to say, oh, this is the play that Shakespeare wrote. I think it's like a half an inch closer to the play that Shakespeare wrote, right? A whole bunch of things happened, which we will get to. But anyway, so getting back to this question of the document, right? So what's the text? Is the text what Shakespeare wrote in what is sometimes called his foul papers, right? Meaning like his first sort of scribbled draft on parchment, right? Or is it the copy that the keeper of the book in the playhouse has annotated with entrances and exits and calls for fights and music, and he's changed speech headings and things like that? Is that the text? Is the text what got printed in those individual editions that Shakespeare didn't pay any attention to in his lifetime? Is the text what ends up in that folio, that huge compendium document? Is this mashup of King Lear's the text? And in 1982, a scholar named Michael Warren was like, you know what? These are two different plays, people. Stop it. And he begins actually, like, a nerd revolution happens in the mid 1980s after Michael Warren writes this book called The Division of the Kingdoms. And he's saying these are two different plays. And he makes his argument over several hundred pages about why these are not just rewrites, that these are different plays, and stop it. And ever since then, and stop it. And ever since then, textual scholarship has really gotten less stable and less stable. So where before it was like, haha, this is it. Now it's much more like, oh, there's a lot of stuff out here and it's messier. It's less clear. It's less, the ground is less firm and more filled with complexity. Does this make sense? I'm talking a lot. Y'all with me so far? Questions about this? Michael Warren. Yeah, The Division of the Kingdoms by Michael Warren.
Okay, when you say two different plays,
yeah,
is it just the language used? I mean, is the structure and the plot and the story still intact? It's just the way that they go about it, or are there different changes in characterization and things like that?
Yeah, Albany is pretty much a different character. The choices that Albany makes are different. In most Shakespeare plays, the last guy speaking is the most powerful guy left standing, right? In one version of King Lear, it's Albany who has the last line. No, sorry. Edgar who has the last line. Edgar, Edmund, I can never remember which one, the good one. The two brothers, I always get them confused. But in one version, it's the brother who has the last line. And so we are kind of led to believe that he's the most powerful guy and maybe he's going to ascend to the throne. But in the other version, it's Kent who has the last line. And so literally the power dynamic of who's in charge at the end changes from one play to the other. So, I mean, it's all the same character. And also like when Lear is in the storm and he's got that sort of mock trial of his daughters, that only appears in one of those texts. That's just not in the other one, right? There's a version of Hamlet where Gertrude is 100% Hamlet's ally against Claudius. Right? There's a whole soliloquy that's only in the second quarto of Hamlet. It is not in the folio. How all occasions do inform against me and spur my dull revenge. 20,000 men go to their graves like beds, right? That is not in the folio. What do I do? What do I do? How do I make sense, right? So what's the text, right? And to Autumn's point a few minutes ago about that idea that we kind of collectively think of as the story, we have these sort of pop culture shorthand ideas of what some of these plays are. Some of the plays nobody knows, right? Unless they're theater nerds. But Taming of the Shrew, for instance, like there's this idea that Kate breaks a lot of crockery, right? Because Liz Taylor broke a lot of crockery in the film. But I would love for you to show me the textual evidence in the play that says that crockery breaking is what this scene is about. That's a choice that one actor and one director made, but that's become the pop culture shorthand for Kate clearly breaks crockery. And it is a misinterpretation of really what's happening. Well, not necessarily a misinterpretation. It is one specific choice, right? But it's not necessarily what's happening there. Hamlet is always the dude with the skull. The skull happens in Act 4, people, for 4 minutes. It is not what the play is about. The play is not about the skull. Yeah, Jesse.
Yeah, I was earlier asked what is the text of Shakespeare, and there's so many like I mean, but like what you're talking about is it passed through so many hands, but even after that, there are certain images that are burned, especially in the American culture, like you said, the skull in the hand, and oh my gosh, you just mentioned her, I'm forgetting her name.
Liz Taylor?
Liz Taylor. Liz Taylor with the crockery, like there's gosh, Richard III, one of the most Oscar-winning Richard III.
Olivier? The Olivier?
Yeah,
Richard
Olivier. We see that image of Richard III, and that's what he looks like, and that's what he needs to look like. So there's like the text transcends actual like page, like it starts to become like an icon or an image of, I guess like that's kind of how there's so many times when I've been a part of a production of Shakespeare, or someone talks about Shakespeare and they only associate it with that movie, with that adaptation, with that image, which is really interesting. Like there's directors that don't want to change it. They're like, we're going to do it that way because that's what Shakespeare did. I'm like, no, that's what Elizabeth Taylor did.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that becomes a problem all across the theater, right? Because somebody who doesn't know Shakespeare very well gets invited to do Taming of the Shrew. And what they do to prepare to direct it is they go watch that film with Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor. And that informs all their choices. And then they miss what's actually going on in that play. Right? Or they make cuts because they don't understand stuff, rather than making thoughtful cuts because I want to foreground this part of the story, right? So I guess really what I wanted, have I succeeded in sort of troubling the concept of what the text is for you a little bit? Awesome. Okay. Cool. Yeah, Casey.
Just because you're mentioning cutting here and there.
Yeah.
I am curious because every once in a while you will meet a theater director who's like, you should never cut anything, you know, like they're very much a purist about it. So like, what is, if it's thoughtfully done, I'm assuming then you're an advocate for it. Is there ever a point in time where it's like, well, no, that it's good to do it in its entirety, or does that make sense?
Yeah, I think you have to think about who your audience is and what the goal of the production is, who you want to come. I mean, it can be neato kino cool to do it, but crikey, I mean, as much as I love these plays, I do not want to sit through 4 hours of Hamlet. And Jesse just mentioned our Kenneth Branagh. Oh, so many thoughts about Kenneth Branagh. 4 hours of a play is a lot, right? My next question for you is, what do you think about the phrase, the 2 hours traffic of our stage? So you teed me up very nicely. Thank you for that. The chorus at the beginning of Romeo and Juliet says, these 2 hours traffic of our stage. Yeah, Lauren.
I'm definitely bad to misrepresent how long something's going to take in real life. But I also think that that might be the target. We're going to get through this. We're going to move fast. Come on, let's go. We can do it in 2 hours.
Yeah, so we think that the actors on the Elizabethan stage spoke a little bit faster than we do. Although after listening to me for the last hour, you're like, how could they speak faster? Really, girl? But a good estimate of a modern production of Shakespeare that's moving at the right clip is you should be able to get through about 1,000 lines in an hour, right? So with a play like Romeo and Juliet that comes in around 2,400 words, it's 2 hours, 20 minutes. Romeo and Juliet's about 2 hours, 20 minutes. Hamlet is 3,700 words. So that means 3¼ hours if you're picking them up and putting them down, right? Pacing, people, right? And that means you really got to earn your pauses, right? You cannot languish, right? Cymbeline also is about 4 hours uncut. King Lear is more than 3½ hours uncut. We think there's a scholar named Andrew Gurr who's done more work on this than anyone else. And he thinks that the performances in the original Elizabethan playhouses were probably somewhere between 2 and 3 hours long. And he thinks that the longer texts are what he calls maximal. And that's where I think you see that quote from Beaumont and Fletcher about some of the scenes the actors left out, right? So a lot of scholars will kind of live and die on that prescription by the chorus, or treat that line by the chorus in Romeo and Juliet as if it's a prescription, right? That it must be 2 hours. But the chorus in Henry V says, turning the accomplishment of many years into an hourglass. And nobody thinks that Henry V was performed in an hour. So I think he's sort of saying, it's an afternoon of entertainment. I don't think there's a connotation that the plays are meant to be cut necessarily, Jesse, but I think they get cut a lot. And I'm trying to think in my career, I've never done an uncut Shakespeare play. I've always made some trims. And again, it depends on the audience, right? If you're doing a play with your 7th graders, you're probably doing a 30-minute Shakespeare. It would be cruel to them and like the end of your sanity to try to do a full Shakespeare with 7th graders, right? Do a 30-minute, maybe do a 40-minute cut with them, right? But the trick is, can you make your cuts in a thoughtful way that continues to tell the story and that isn't just like this scorched earth policy, right? We're going to talk more about cutting later. So Hamlet, right? As I said, three different versions of Hamlet. One is 3,668 lines long. That's the longest one. That's what's called the second quarto, right? So it came out basically in paperback twice, right? And there's a whole mystery and set of questions about that. But the second quarto is the longest. And then the folio, that big collection that was printed in 1623, is about 150 lines shorter. But it's not like it's clearly just because there's stuff in the folio that is not in that second quarto. There's stuff in the second quarto that is not in the folio. So it's not like they just cut some. It's like it's been revised very thoughtfully. And there are places where there's like half a line missing and a whole line and then a half a line so that the two remaining half lines slide together and the verse, the meter of the verse is preserved. So if it wasn't Shakespeare making those cuts, it was somebody in his company who was very thoughtfully revising. So what does it mean when we say Shakespeare? We haven't even gotten to the printing house yet. Yeah, Casey.
Well, in some ways, and I think this is what I was trying to get at when I was watching the Shakespeare in Love clip, is that theater was so communal and not so hedged off. Like it's not as though Shakespeare would have been surprised that the actors were kind of messing with his lines or that somebody told him to make a cut or that, right? Like that wouldn't have been shocking. That was how it was done. And so if you think about there being like one person who is kind of steering the ship, almost like the director, but instead it's the playwright, but then everyone gets some creative say, it's still his play.
Except that he wasn't necessarily the guy steering the ship.
That's true. That's true. It's still his play though. So it's like
it's not his play.
Oh.
It's not his play. The company owns the play.
Gotcha. He's the original author, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
He's the original author. And then he gives it over to the community to work together on it. And so we still think of it as belonging to him because that's just the way it worked in that time.
Mm-hmm.
Am I on the right track?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of works that way now, right? Tom Stoppard writes a new play and all of the actors are going to make suggestions in the rehearsal room, and so is the dramaturg, and so is the director, and then it's going to get printed and it's going to have Sir Tom's name on it. And then he's going to come to do the production in New York, and there's going to be a whole new set of revisions. And then you've got two different versions of The Coast of Utopia. You got the published version after the production at the National, and then you have the version that was published after the production at Lincoln Center. And those are very similar, but they're not the same. And Tom Stoppard blessed both of them. Right? And lots of people's mitts were on them. But now we respect the author in a way that the Elizabethans did not, right? We don't question that it's Sir Tom's play. But once Shakespeare or Dekker or Middleton or Henry Chettle wrote the play, it belonged to the company. Shakespeare had a little bit of a leg up because he was a member of the company that owned his play. But that didn't, so maybe he was more, but this is, we don't know this part, right? This is speculation. Maybe he was more involved. But if he wasn't the keeper of the book, there was for sure somebody else who was making lots of revisions and annotations in the Playhouse. Does that make sense? You ready for some more? Ready for the next bit? Okay, so let's talk about other people. Oh yeah, Brad, what you got?
Just does it have to do with the commercial nature of the theater, in that the ownership depicts, kind of who owns it, has the rights to it as a modern day thing? If Shakespeare didn't have kind of if the company had the rights, right? It wasn't necessarily a commercial adventure, right? It was kind of owned and supported by patrons, yes? Do you know what I mean? And so it's like, it wasn't that
It's
we
pretty
think of
commercial.
but the playwright nowadays, is, to own the rights to it and to have that and to create the definitive ownership of it,
Yeah.
right? When
Yeah.
did that change based, and why did that change?
Yeah, it starts to change after the English Civil War, right? When the theaters reopen in the 1660s, that change starts to take hold. But in the Elizabethan and then the Jacobean period, which covers all of Shakespeare's life, right? That idea of authorship was very different to how we understand it. And like I said, right, and I'll show you this in a minute, but for the first several years of his career, when one of his plays got printed, his name was not even on the cover page. It didn't matter who the playwright was. Who's that? The author? Nobody. It didn't matter who wrote it. What mattered was who had performed it. That was what people were interested in. And if you look at like a New Dramatist edition of any new play, right, you'll see at the beginning, they'll tell you where the first production was, right? And maybe who the producer and the director and the actors were in that first production. Similarly, in those New Dramatist editions, right, the stage directions are not necessarily authorial. Those are probably from the stage manager and the director of that first production. If you want to see the kind of the play that the author wrote, there might be a separate like TCG edition of the play, right? And that might be a helpful way to think about this too, right? Like if you think about the New Dramatist script of, say, Lynn Nottage's Sweat, right? That's going to have stage directions from the stage manager from that first production. But if you look at the TCG publication of Lynn Nottage's Sweat, those are her stage directions. And there may be some overlap, but they're not exactly the same. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. So let's talk about the next person who had their fingers on the play. So the Master of the Revels. Sounds like a good job, right? The Master of the Revels. Where'd my notes go? Where'd he go? There he is. For all of Shakespeare's career, it was a guy named Edmund Tilney. And he had to bless a play before it could be performed. So any play that got written by any playwright for any company in the city of London had to go through the office of the Master of the Revels. It had to get licensed. Okay. The Master of the Revels was appointed by the Queen. His responsibilities included regulation of plays performed in the public theaters, right? He might grant an unconditional license to perform, or he might license the play subject to revisions like the ones you see on the screen. The oaths taken out, leave out all public ribaldry. Or in the case of a play called Sir Thomas More, he said, leave out the insurrection wholly and the cause thereof. And if you leave it in, it's at your own perils. So he's warning the company, these are the changes they have to make in order to produce and stage this play, right? And so he's sometimes making, yeah, he's definitely a censor. Absolutely. So his overriding interest, Edmund Tilney, who is played by Simon Callow in the film Shakespeare in Love, is to please the Queen, because she loves the theater, and there's a substantive kind of subset of people in London who think that the theaters are stews of corruption and they would like them shut down, right? So it's important to the monarchy that the theaters have some standards and that they don't talk about certain things. Insurrection is right out, right? So, and then the other thing that the Master of Revels was responsible for is, like Philostrate in Midsummer Night's Dream, he's responsible for providing the entertainment at court, right? So he's advising the theaters on how to sort of keep to the straight and narrow on certain things, and protecting the theaters from that anti-theatrical lobby from the Puritans who want to see them shut down. Yeah, not unlike modern evangelical. Yeah, for sure. There's definitely a relationship there. So sedition suddenly has new relevance in our world, right? Sedition was not allowed on stage. And in the surviving versions of Richard II, there is a publication that does not have the overthrow of the king in it. Like, that whole scene is missing. And then there's another version where we have it. So that's the scene maybe we could not stage in the public playhouse, right? Do you want to give anybody any ideas? So all plays had to be licensed by the Master of the Revels, and he could mandate these changes. Yeah. So you can see the most lamentable. So this is the cover page of the first printed copy of Titus Andronicus. And you'll see that there is no playwright's name on this. There's no author named. As it was, but what they do tell us is, as it was played by the Right Honorable, the Earl of Derby, Earl of Pembroke, and the Earl of Suffolk, their servants, which is an awkward way of saying that's the theater company that performed Titus Andronicus, right? But that's a selling point. That's a marketing tool, because people maybe saw that production, and so they want to own a copy of that play, which gets to that who's literate and who's not in the theater, right? But we know that people wanted to read the plays that they had seen, because over and over we see this kind of language on the cover page, right? So this is 1594. This is pretty early in Shakespeare's career, right? He's born in 1564, so he's 30 years old, right? And we know, and the other thing that's sort of interesting to note, right? It says printed by John Danter and to be sold by Edward White and Thomas Millington at the little north door of Paul's at the sign of the gun. So in the early modern printing industry, most of the sellers of books had stalls in the yard of St. Paul's Church. If you've been to London, you know, that huge dome, right? In the yard of St. Paul's was where mostly the books were sold. And so what he's telling you is, if you go to Paul's and you look for the sign of the gun over a stall, you're going to know that that's where this book is available, right? And again, you see that information about who the printer was, where it was performed, and where you can buy it. Those are the things that show up most often. So again, who wrote it? Who cares? Nobody. Almost, Jesse, but the roles of the printer and the publisher were two different people usually. And the publisher, in a way, was like a theatrical producer now who puts up the money. And then the printer was the guy who literally owned the print house where the pages were manufactured. And we're going to learn a lot about the print house in a little while. So the tragedy of King Richard III. Again, what do you notice on that page? No author, as it hath lately been acted. Yeah, exactly. No author. Yeah, so as for the spelling question, and this is an important point when you get to that sort of tooth fairy of the first folio business, spelling is not stable in the period, right? That doesn't happen until much later. So people spell things how they spell them, and it doesn't mean between how we spell tragedy on the cover of Richard III here and how we spell tragedy on the cover of Romeo and Juliet. There's no deep meaning to read into those two different, there's just two different ways of spelling the same thing. The people who set that type are spelling it the way it makes sense to them. Yeah, the containing section, right? So again, this is like a marketing tool, containing his treacherous plots against his brother Clarence. Ooh, that was one of the good bits in the Playhouse. Oh yeah, right? Like, it's like a trailer for a film showing you some of the cool bits, right? The pitiful murder of his innocent nephews, his tyrannical usurpation, and the whole course of his detested life and most deserved death. Blah. Who doesn't want that? Right? And then with Romeo and Juliet, as it hath been often with great applause played publicly. We are selling books, people. Spelling would still be unstable, indeed, right? Yeah, but it's super unstable. And we'll see once we get to looking at the folio in a few weeks. Each of the guys, there were 8 different guys who were involved in setting the type in the printing house where the folio was manufactured. And each of those guys had his own habits. And again, bless the guy who studied this so we don't have to, right? We can just benefit from what he figured out. Yeah. 1598, look what happens. W. Shakespeare makes it onto the title page. All of a sudden, that guy's name is marketing. Suddenly that has value. A pleasant conceited comedy called Love's Labour's Lost. Again, as it was presented before Her Highness the last Christmas. That sounds fancy, right? Newly corrected and augmented. Revised and edited, augmented and corrected. Well, they're not redacted. Jesse's asking in the chat about the titles. I would say they're distilled, right? So we tend to take the titles from the titles that were used in the first folio. Although even there you get like the most lamentable tragedy of Romeo and Juliet, and we just call it Romeo and Juliet. And he's telling us that the name of the comedy is Love's Labour's Lost, right? But a pleasant conceited comedy is marketing language, right? This is the blurb that's going to help sell it. That makes sense? But so we start to see, even in 1598, in 1594, 1595, 1596, 1597, Shakespeare's name is not going to sell a book. All of a sudden, newly corrected and augmented by W. Shakespeare means something. Yeah. So what is editing? Oh yeah, Autumn.
If his name was not necessarily attached to any of the shows or productions beforehand, what do you think was the thing that spurred them to start including it? And was there kind of like name recognition? And so people said, oh, that's the guy that wrote this, so I guess I'll go. But if it wasn't included before, how did that come about?
So people would have heard his name in the Playhouse when they went to see the play. And also he's an actor in the company. So he's performing in a lot of the plays. So now it starts to be, not only was that a play by Shakespeare that I saw at the Playhouse, but the fact that it's by Shakespeare is going to interest some people who maybe didn't see it in the Playhouse.
So it's a pretty big accomplishment for him to have moved onto the title page.
Yep.
In that way. Okay.
Yeah, correct. It's a big deal. Yeah, Brad.
Well, I have kind of the same question. Was he announced in the Playhouse then that he was the writer?
Yeah.
That they said, this is Shakespeare, he wrote this play. People went, cool.
Yeah, or sometimes they had a banner that had the name of the play on the stage. And again, that gets to that division between who can read that banner and who cannot, right? And there's in some plays, Shakespeare doesn't do this, but a lot of the other playwrights at the time would sometimes make a joke about a character in the first scene, maybe looking at that banner and commenting on it. And in one case, no, we're not doing that play. And then they took that banner down and brought another one out and put it up. And so that's kind of a joke on the people in the audience who can read, who think they're expecting one thing and now they're changing it, right? But of course, the people who can't read, it doesn't signify to them, right? Yeah, actors' names never get printed on the cover of these texts. Yeah, it's the company. It's the Lord Chamberlain's men. It's the Admiral's men. It's Lord Derby's men. Men. Mm-hmm. So what is editing? The Queen's Women, I wish. Yeah. What is editing? Anybody have an idea?
I don't feel like I know anything anymore, but revisions to make adjustments and improvements, whatever that might mean. That's completely subjective of what an improvement or adjustment might be that's better, but that's sort of what springs to mind.
Sure. Good start. Yes, Lauren.
Taking something that somebody has created and offering to be a second pair of eyes, taking a pass at what it is and what it's doing in order to clarify for the initial artist that it's doing what they think it's doing and what they're wanting it to do in the way that they want to do it. Maybe. I'm also with Casey and Brad that I don't have any confidence in my answers anymore.
So this is the beginning of bibliography, is destabilizing all the things, right? But you're both hitting on pieces of it. Yeah, Autumn, what you thinking?
Oh, I love everyone's just sudden lack of confidence, myself included. It's silly and small, but I worked in letterpress in like a class in my university, and one of the like small edits that I noticed is when you're working and setting the typeface for the page that you're printing, if you run out of F's, you run out of F's. And so if there's a bunch of words that have F at the end of the page, those words aren't making it. And so it's like as simple as like, we just don't have that available anymore. So the person printing the page is saying, I'm also contributing as an editor, albeit if it's literarily or not, it's happening. And I think that's so wonderful.
Yes, I'm just looking. I'm sorry to turn away. I'm just trying to find something to make a point. And where is my script? Oh my goodness. Oh, there you are. Okay. So if you think about that book of Love's Labor's Lost that we just looked at, right? A pleasant conceited comedy called Love's Labor's Lost. In fact, I'll bring it back up for a second, right? So we can just. So just literally look at Love's Labor's Lost. What do you see? Jump on in.
Two different S's.
Two different S's, yeah. What else? Yeah, Lauren, so one of the things you're identifying, that FT, or what looks like an FT, that's called a ligature. And that is any piece of type that has sort of two letters traveling together. That's an individual piece of type. That's not, yeah. So that's a ligature for lost, even though it looks like an F. The Elizabethans would have read that as an S. right? So then if I hold this up, how are those different? Just the title words. What's changed?
My apprentice company First Folio heads would say, well, the V in love is softer when you pronounce it according to the First Folio. So it's love as opposed to love. It's great.
It's crap.
Spelling of labors has changed.
Spelling of labors has changed. Also, there's an apostrophe. There's a couple apostrophes now, right?
All those letters are capitalized, but I was noticing that there's only one capital L in the
Mhm.
original.
Yeah. So I'm just curious if we go to the. Yeah, so Richard David, now we have an editor. Shakespeare's name is up at the top, right? Now Shakespeare's name is a heading. And the person who is in sort of that authorial position now is the editor, right? So part of what he's done is he's modernized the spelling because we don't have ligatures anymore. And we look at them and we go, what do I do with that, right? We're spelling love with a V instead of a U. And he's made a choice about where the apostrophes should go. There's nothing on this page that tells you that he's made all those decisions for you. They're invisible. And there's I don't know, 10,000 invisible choices that a contemporary editor is making for you in any one of these, whether it's, Bevington in the Riverside, or it's an Arden, or it's an Oxford, or a New Cambridge, right? And these are all good additions. Like none of them need to hang their heads in shame, right? They're all good and credible additions, but they're all making choices. A lot of adapted by XYZ, yeah. So the editor is mediating the text for us in some way. He's making some choices, right? He's looking at whatever that source was, and coming from an Elizabethan playhouse, it might be what we call the author's foul papers, or the author's manuscript, right? His first copy that he wrote down. It might be that script, probably not, but it might be that script that the keeper of the book has made all his changes in. The reason I say it's probably not that is because if the company thinks they're still going to perform that play, they are not letting that sucker out of their sight, because that is the document by which they are going to go back into production, right? So the other thing it could be is what's called a scribal copy. And that means that the company has hired a scribe to make a clean copy, to hand write out the whole thing and make a clean copy. And here's the thing about the scribes, right? So we got everybody in the playhouses putting their 2 cents in. We got the master of the revels making some suggestions. Now the scribes come along, and each one of those scribes who was working in Elizabethan England had his own set of habits. There's a guy named Ralph Crane who is responsible for the copy from which several plays were set for the First Folio. Ralph Crane has his own set of habits. He does a thing like he masses all the entrances, right? So instead of having people enter the scene at whatever moment they're supposed to enter the scene, he just sticks them all at the front of the scene, whether it makes sense for them to be there or not, right? There's a whole bunch of things that Ralph Crane is doing that for him are aesthetic choices that have nothing to do with the content, right? But then that's the text that shows up in the printing house. And then 8 different guys have to set it, right? And we'll talk a whole lot more about what happens in the printing house. But so an editor is modernizing spelling in many cases. They're looking at those textual cruxes that we were talking about, sullied and solid, for instance, and making a choice. Which one do they think it is, right? They are coming to grips with a lot of performance traditions. They might be looking at choices that editors have been making about the play for 300 years, and they're weighing whether they dare disturb the universe by making a different choice, or whether they're going to go along with whatever has been done so far. And like I said, it's only relatively recently that they've started to look at the discrete texts as their whole own play, as opposed to mashing them all together. What's been done for 300 years is a big thing. Yeah, absolutely. Like pressure, right? All these guys thought this was a good idea. So how's that for the first day of school, y'all? Questions so far? Well, let me get rid of that. Sorry. I can still see all of you, so I forget that it's up there. Oh, one more thing I want to tell you before we stop, and we'll come back to this, but a thing happens in 1606. A law gets passed by Parliament. It's called the Act to Restrain the Abuses of the Players. And part of what happens is you can't curse on stage anymore. And so if you're going to revive any play that was written before 1605, you have to edit it and take out the profanity. So you get things like in Measure for Measure, instead of saying God in my mouth, as if I did but chew his name, which scans and makes sense. Now, the text that we have, again, which is the only text we have, is the one that was revised by Middleton, and he revised it after the Act to Restrain the Abuses of the Players. So the line in every modern edition is heaven in my mouth, as if I did but chew his name. Because you can say heaven, but you can't say God. Heaven doesn't scan. Heaven doesn't make sense. Because heaven isn't a he, right? So anyway, those are everywhere. We have about 10 minutes left. We daren't Costco, yes, but we can murder people and we can bake them into pies, right? Like that's fine. Just don't take the Lord's name in vain. So syllabus questions. Do you know what this class is about now, Jesse? One thing in the syllabus that I realized I had said was that I had scaffolded the readings, and then I realized that I actually never got around to doing that. So the version of the syllabus that's been up on Canvas for like a week doesn't have that, but I uploaded a new version today. So you may want to download the syllabus afresh. It hasn't changed. I revised and adapted, right? It is newly corrected and augmented. So it is substantively the same, but you'll see each week under the readings, they're numbered, right? And those numbers are, as I always say, of course, I would love it if you had time to read everything. I also understand that you have lives and jobs and families and other responsibilities, and life happens. So when you can, read everything. If you want the deepest possible understanding, read everything. If you're pressed for time, if you have shit going down and you can only get to one thing, read the thing that's labeled first. Because that way we can at least all show up to class and have something in common. Yeah. So for next week, all of the readings are kind of about what was going on in the Playhouse. Right. And we're going to kind of move our way through these things. So like we'll talk next week about the Playhouse in a lot of detail, and then we'll start to look at the printing press and what movable type has to do with all this. And then we'll get into specifically the Playhouse, or excuse me, the printing house of William and Isaac Jaggard, which is where the first folio was printed, and what kinds of shenanigans were going on in that specific printing house. So that's sort of what the first few weeks are going to look like. Yeah. And this is the part where I just have to talk a lot, but so questions, anybody have questions? Confused by Cool. Okay. Well, that was easy. Right on. Have a good weekend, y'all. So glad you're here. I will hang around if anybody has a question.